This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
When we made our McDonald's Spicy Chicken McNuggets, you were praise hands emoji. Then we ran out, and you were streaming tears emoji. Now they're back, so you can be grinning face with sweat emoji. Order ahead on the McDonald's app.
And get Money Mouth Face emoji with 2 orders of crispy, irresistible 10-piece McNuggets, spicy or classic, for just $6. Limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I'm Stephen Metcalf, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest Beyoncé Country Kaleidoscope Edition. It's Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. On today's show, Beyoncé. She's been teasing the idea of a country album for a while now. Here is Act 2, Cowboy Carter. As to whether it's a country record, opinions vary. I guess mostly people say not really, but not really. So anyway, we're going to need to discuss it. And of course, that means Nadira Goffe, Slate's own Nadira Goffe, will join us to discuss. And then the Romanian film Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World comes courtesy of the director Radu Jude. It has a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, was nominated for Best International Feature. We decided it's high time to discuss it. I, for one, am very glad we did. And finally, Steve Martin has spent nearly half a century as part of the collective pop consciousness of the world. A new documentary, Steve! Martin, a documentary in 2 pieces, is now on Apple TV. It explores his stand-up, his movie career, struggles with his demons. It's from director Morgan Neville. Joining me today is Julia Turner, currently of the Annenberg School of Journalism at USC, a fellow there. Hey, Julia.
Hello, hello.
And of course, Dana Stevens is the film critic for Slate. Hey, Dana.
Hey, Steve! !
Yes, I want to address you as Steve! Henceforth.
All right. Shall we dive in?
Let's do it.
Act 2, Cowboy Carter, is the new record from Beyoncé. It contains way too many multitudes to be called a country album, though it was teased as such, as we said. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. It contains way too many multitudes to be called a country album. In the end, as has been said, it's a Beyoncé album. It's confected out of many influences. It features many collabs. In addition to its obvious country elements, there are spoken word cameos from Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton. There's a duet with Miley Cyrus and a cover of Blackbird, the Paul McCartney old Beatles song, sung with 4 young black women of country. Still, all this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a 27-track album. Why don't we listen to its biggest hit thus far, Texas Hold'em?
This ain't Texas, ain't no Hold'em. Hey. So lay your cards down, 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 down. So park your Lexus and throw your keys up. Hey. Stick around, round, 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 round. Stick around. And I'll be damned if I can't slow dance with you. Come pour some sugar on me, honey, too. It's a real live boogie and a real live hold down. Don't be a bitch, come take it to the floor now. Woo! There's a tornado in my city. Hit the basement. That shit ain't pretty.
All right. Well, we're joined by Nadira Goffe, the resident Beyoncologist. I don't know. Slate culture writer extraordinaire and very, very good friend of this program. Nadira, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, and everyone has to refer to me as a Beyoncologist from now on.
I was actually thinking that we should name Nadira our chief Beyoncé correspondent in addition to her VVG FOP status.
Done.
I will take all of it.
I love it.
Amazing.
Nadira, I mean, there was sort of a tease going on here about, is it a country album? How country is it going to be if it is? And here is the record. I mean, where do you even grab a hold of this? It's quite the it's just multitudinous in a way. Where do you want to start?
It's really hard to say, right? Because I don't think anyone was expecting Beyoncé, who is known for her meticulousness and for her sort of perfectly crafted projects, to release a behemoth of an album that's 27 named tracks and about close to 80 minutes long. It's an hour and 18, and like you were saying, multiple genres, sometimes in different songs, sometimes multiple genres within one song. And I think a lot of people are sort of having a hard time digesting this as one entire singular body of work. From what I can tell, this is kind of her most divisive album, at least in recent memory. And I'm having a lot of fun just sort of seeing where everyone's at. I know people who love to sort of play the full thing every time they listen. I'm someone who really has to deal with this project in separate chunks and pieces. It's hard for me to sort of even piece together a lot of it, in one go. And I think that's because I personally think it's maybe her most experimental album thus far. And by nature, also her least polished, but I'm not necessarily angry at that. I like hearing her take on these different genres. I like some of the places she goes, and I really commend her for trying new things, at least some things I've never heard before.
Yeah. I mean, the confidence paired with the experimentalism, to me, is the most striking thing about it. Like, just the assurance, the knowledge, the sense of scholarship within it. Like, there are so many references. There's this mix of like deep archival knowledge and loose playfulness. I was like, is this a prog rock? Like, there's just so much playfulness and experiment. And I have been listening to it as an album because I feel like the sequencing and the structure of it feel pertinent. The way that she's kind of tracking you through history, pulling in archival clips of musicians from history who've made an impact on country, the conversation with Dolly Parton that's in it through a couple of different moments in the track, including Beyonce's much discussed cover of Jolene. The combination of like looseness and dexterity and confidence and knowledge are all so fun in it, I think.
The confidence in this album, I think, is also really intentional and a part of the overall point. A lot of this album is a sort of response to Beyoncé's history of being mistreated in these sort of traditionally, culturally white spaces in music. And I think she both starts and ends this album with some very blatant, FUs to her whole 2016 situation when she performed Daddy Lessons with the Chicks at the CMAs and the backlash to that, her being overlooked for Album of the Year wins at the Grammys and, the backlash to that, and all of these sort of different examples in her career where people told her she wasn't enough, whether she wasn't country enough or she wasn't good enough. And here she's giving you this album that is really confident in saying, I don't care what you think. And I think a lot of people are also sort of on the fence of how they even feel about that, which I think is fascinating.
The first track on the album that might be my favorite, American Requiem, I mean, I wouldn't call it country at all. It's more gospel, right?
It's a lot of talking going on while I sing my song. Can you hear me?
It's like church-style layered harmonies, which I think are all probably Beyoncé harmonizing with herself.
Look at that now. Look at that. Look at that.
I think in a way it's maybe was not great for me to kick off with my very favorite song, because to me this 80 plus minutes of music kind of lost some momentum near the end. And that may be just because it starts to sound a little bit more like what you might expect from Beyonce, more like dance music and rapping, whereas it starts off, with this very rootsy, folksy, gospel influenced sound. I wonder, Steve, if you had favorite tracks that also took you somewhere unexpected musically.
Well, yeah, let me just first say I kind of love this record. I mean, it's sprawling and therefore maybe, focus won't be its strong point, but so what? That's true of like Leaves of Grass. I mean, it's a remarkably produced record and her singing immediately captivates me. beginning, Dana, as you say, with that remarkable gospel, neo-gospel piece, American Requiem, right at the beginning. I think for me personally, there are things that just strike me as something of a misfire a little bit. The Jolene doesn't quite work for me, nor the Blackbird. I mean, I think they're honoring the sources in ways that I respect, but they just don't work for me as a rethinking of the original material. But first of all, I love this single. I think Texas Hold'em is just a great pop song with some country elements to it, and the acoustic guitar playing seems really instrumental to the sound of it. But the one that jumped out at me that I'm embarrassed to say I just didn't know yet, even though it's been a hit already, was 16 Carriages. I think it's a really, really, really strong tune.
16 carriages driving away while I watch them ride with my dreams away to the summer sunset.
Yeah, 16 Carriages was actually released as a joint single, a double with Texas Hold'em when Beyoncé first announced the album, and it definitely got much love then. And this was also sort of the time where, given Texas Hold'em and 16 Carriages, and given all of the sort of aesthetic hints that Beyoncé was giving during the press run-up to the album, everyone thought this was going to be a purely country album. And then Beyoncé said herself, right before the album came out, this is not a country album, this is a Beyoncé album. And I definitely think that there are certain songs on here that prove that. I think the song, though it is maybe not my most favorite, it's one of my favorites, which proves that the most, is Riverdance, because Riverdance is this sort of string plucking beat song, but that also has a dance percussion and a dance groove to it. And it feels like the sort of most linear connection between her previous album, Renaissance, and Cowboy Carter, this current album, to me. But I think the song, besides Jolene, that everyone is talking about, amongst the few maybe, are the two most wanted, the collaboration with Miley Cyrus, which I really want to talk about, and the song Ya Ya, which is this sort of really widely ranging, genre-defying version of a song.
Hello, girls.
Hello, Beyoncé.
Hello, fellas.
You're pretty swell.
Those petty ones can't fuck with me.
Why?
'Cause I'm a clever girl. We snapping.
That, has everything from a sample of Boots Are Made for Walking to Beach Boy references to Tina Turner vocals.
We clapping. We drumming.
And I'd love to hear what you guys sort of thought about this massive, massive song.
I enjoyed Yaya. I don't think it's going to become on heavy rotation for me. I think it's one of those songs that's so up-tempo, it's less my groove. But I enjoyed the exuberance of it. I mean, it's funny. I found myself drawn to some of the quieter songs on the record and just enjoyed all the different multivalent winks to types of country and tropes in country. I mean, there's a song called Spaghetti that's much more hip-hop-y, but has a little bit of Ennio Morricone spaghetti western vibes in it, and kind of connects various kinds of, violent musical imagery together in an interesting way. But I found myself really loving the songs Protector and Bodyguard, which take up themes of family. I'm so interested to hear you say, Steve, that the Blackbird didn't work for you, because to me that one is transcendent and almost works better than the original. And there's been some interesting connection back to stuff McCartney has said about writing that song, which is that it was really about the Black woman's experience in the civil rights movement, and that, that's a place where maybe that's a Paul McCartney song that's been waiting for Beyoncé to sing it all these years, actually. And I did find that in the song. I heard it completely anew and was oh, whoa, this is so perfect and beautiful. And the Jolene is fun, but it's almost like a gimmick or a gag, kind of, because the particular beauty of that song is of the original. I don't know. That one felt less like a transcendent piece of art and more like kind of a playful gag. But Protector, which is a song sort of about motherhood and protecting her daughters, her children, it's just been going through my head, and it's got this quiet, strong loveliness to it. And then Bodyguard too has this kind of romantic but strong love in it. I don't know. So much of young Beyoncé was like type A trying to hit the marks, and mature Beyoncé is just so rich and playful and expressive. I don't know.
It feels
really
free, I think, to me, in a way that, like, I don't think young Beyoncé would ever change the lyrics to Jolene. I'm so glad that we at least have a version of Beyoncé, whether you like the song or not. I personally love it and am currently in the midst of writing an entire Slate sort of explainer about the whole controversy surrounding it and the response and my take on it. But, whether or not you like the song, I think it says something that we have a Beyoncé now who will take those chances and then turn around and, sample a Patsy Cline song on a shorter like trap song called Sweet Honey Buckin', which I think is something I never would have heard her do. And then to also sort of, like you were saying, have the freedom to write such a beautiful ode to motherhood like Protector, which also to me alludes to a sort of imminent retirement on her part. I think there are a few songs on this album that really feel like, she's going to release one more album like she was promised, that this entire journey of hers is a 3-act journey. This is Act 2. And I think after that third album, she might retire for the foreseeable future. And so it's really cool to just see her throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Which I also feel like is one of the other connotations to spaghetti, which it's funny because it's very funny to think about Beyoncé, who's so hyper-controlled and disciplined, being a spaghetti at the wall type of person. Like I can think of like no metaphor that less applies to any artist, and yet somehow it's not inappropriate here. But speaking of musical retirement, the other thing that's interesting to me is how Jay-Z almost has become Beyonce's muse. Like it's so much more classical for the male artist to have the, female paramour be the muse. But the way in which she's made their relationship and their struggles and their marriage and their family part of her core subject matter, and it's, I think, more directly addressed here than it was in Renaissance, although there were touches of it there too. But that's just I sort of love that as an arc for Jay-Z as well.
I really, really like this. I love experimental Beyoncé. And I think I actually also really appreciate it for the discourse, some of which I find maddening, particularly the discourse around Jolene for various reasons, but some of which I find, sort of really illuminating and really special.
Say more, Nadira. You're writing a piece about it. I'm curious for your own personal take on the song, which we should say, kind of reconfigures the ballad from begging Jolene not to take one's man to kind of
threatening her.
Yeah, warning.
Warning is the term. It's like
Jolene, I'm warning you, don't come for my man.
Warning with very threatening overtones.
Try it, Jolene. You will not succeed, you poor fool.
Don't take the chance because you think you can. You're beautiful beyond compare. Takes more than beauty and seductive stares to come.
I really liked the song. At first, when I listened to it, I just laughed. And I should preface this by saying that I absolutely love Dolly Parton and I love Jolene. I don't love Jolene as much as I love the song 9 to 5, but in terms of Dolly Parton hits, I love Jolene. And so this isn't, just me talking about a song that I don't really care about and a newer version by one of my favorite artists. No, this is me talking about one of my favorite songs by one of my favorite artists being reimagined by a different one of my favorite artists. And so from that standpoint, I laughed at first because I thought it was so bold and so funny. And like you were saying, Julia, I hope you said this before, but more of a gag than of a sort of serious take. But then when I listened to it again, I started to see it in just a much more serious light. It's a really controversial song. It's probably the most controversial point on this album. A lot of people are mourning the loss of the vulnerability that the original song possesses. But I don't think earnestly that there is a world in which today's Beyoncé can convey vulnerability of feeling threatened by another sort of unnamed woman in the way that a Dolly Parton could, especially sort of like referentially in the past. And so instead, what she gives us is this very confident, very threatening song warning a Jolene not to take her man. And I find it really interesting because a lot of the sort of controversy or people who think the song doesn't necessarily work for them in any way are sort of diametrically opposed to a group who unilaterally loves it, which are Black women. A lot of Black women that I've talked to, that I've read, have really identified with this version of the song versus sort of almost everybody else who has, sort of mourned the loss of what was original. And I think that this bothers me for a few reasons. One, the original song is there. If that's what you want, you can listen to it. I don't think that Beyoncé made out, to redo the song in order to make it better or something. I think she's just providing her take. I don't think that there is a sort of like beauty that can be lost from the original because that's not necessarily what she's trying to do. But second, I find the sort of over analyzing of it to be a little burdensome. Like, there are people who are taking it very, very literally, which I understand. And then there are people who are sort of like, oh, well, this is fun, but I just don't care for it at all, which I also understand. But for me, there's a sort of sweet spot in the middle where I do think certain lyrics are specific, but a lot of it is just this sort of energy that I think it's important for the album to have, and it's a sort of important story to tell. A lot of Black women and a lot of Black families have sort of felt under threat, right? And I think that a lot of Black women identify with this message of, I know my worth. It's more so I'm warning you that I've built something here and I'm not going to let you tear it down. Like I have spilt blood, sweat, and tears for this. And that's something that if you're not going to respect, I'm going to make you respect. And I think a lot of Black women sort of have that energy or feel that way or can relate to that experience. And that to me is a sort of more important message that's being lost in the discourse. But I also really quickly want to say that my actual conspiracy theory is that I think Jolene is from the point of view of Beyoncé's mother and not from the point of view of Beyoncé herself. And then I think the subsequent song, Daughter, is from the point of view of Beyoncé herself. And so, I feel a lot of ways about the song, but it's been an interesting discourse to see play out.
Yeah, I think left out of the wide discussion about her recasting of Dolly Parton's song is that Dolly Parton herself introduces it on one of these little vocal snippets that Steve was talking about, right? These kind of DJ moments where it almost feels like you're tuning a car radio and getting different things. So what you get for just a few seconds really as a lead-in is Dolly Parton basically signing the song over to Beyoncé to redo, right? She says, oh, remember Becky with the good hair, that hussy with the good hair you sang about, right? Like her little Lemonade reference. And then she says, well, she reminds me of somebody I used to know. I myself am not utterly wowed by that cover of Jolene, but it doesn't seem worth fighting about because, as Julia was saying, it's all part of the playful texture of this album.
Yeah, and Dolly also requested it, It's not just that Dolly is on the album sort of passing the baton, but there are video clips of Dolly Parton being interviewed where Trevor Noah asks her, oh, I heard that you've requested years ago for Beyoncé to specifically cover Jolene. And Dolly says yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
I wanted her to cover this song. And, I think it's kind of wild, the reaction.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's Act 2 Cowboy Carter from Beyoncé. And, of course, you've been listening to Nadira Goffe, the chief Beyoncé correspondent for the Slate Culture Gabfest. Thanks for coming on, Nadira.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me about your mama's kitchen. That simple request opens up a flood of delicious memories, and it's at the center of the Audible original podcast, Your Mama's Kitchen. On Your Mama's Kitchen, host Michelle Norris talks to guests like Michelle Obama, Glennon Doyle, Leslie Jones, Matthew McConaughey, and more about how their earliest culinary experiences helped shape their personal and professional lives. And of course, each guest brings a recipe for a favorite dish from their youth, so you can taste a bit of their story. It's a show about cuisine and culture, ingredients and identities, and the meals and memories that make us who we are. Find Your Mama's Kitchen anywhere you listen. The new Starz series Mary and George, starring Julianne Moore and Nicholas Galitzine, tells a story almost too outrageous to be true. But shockingly, it is. With next to nothing to her name and looking to elevate her social standing, Mary Villiers sets her handsome and charming son George on the path to seduce King James I and become his all-powerful lover. You've never seen a mother-son duo like this before. This show is full of wit, scandal, action, and, did I mention, Julianne Moore. Something this audacious and sexy is as genre-bending as it gets. You won't be able to look away. Mary and George premieres April 5th only on Starz and the Starz app.
All right, before we go any further, this is typically where we discuss business. Dana, what do we got?
Just one thing, Steve, just telling listeners about today's Slate Plus segment. And today's Slate Plus segment is inspired by the fact that Julia is recording from a hotel room in Honolulu. And because we had to sort of change things around for that recording, we were talking about hotels and how we feel about them, and thought we would just do a little impressionistic discussion of our history and experience with staying in hotels, which, given that Steve is a travel writer, he might have some interesting stuff to bring from that angle. If you're a Slate Plus member, you will hear that hotel chat at the end of this week's show. And if you're not, you can become one by going to slate.com/cultureplus. When you're a member, you get extra segments like the one I just described. You get unlimited access to all of the writing and all of the podcasting on slate.com, and you'll never have to hear me read another ad. Best of all, you'll be supporting the magazine, our work, and the work of our colleagues. So please, if you haven't already, sign up today at slate.com/cultureplus. Okay, Steve, back to the show.
Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World is the new film from Romanian director Radu Jude. Not unlike Cowboy Carter, it's impossible to sum up succinctly. It's a slice of life movie in the European auteur mode. It's a very curious pastiche of found elements, and it's a polemic against the forces of global capital. It stars Ilinca Manolake as an overworked, harried young woman whose job it is to conduct pre-interviews for a safety at work video. She's helping to make it on behalf of a large international conglomerate. She spends an inordinate amount of time during the film in her car, fighting off road rage incidents and incompetent driving, listening to loud music. There's often very little dialogue in the film. In between stints in the car, she makes satirical short videos using a digital filter that make her look like a young man, in which she spouts the most grotesquely misogynistic and hypersexual and violent rhetoric. By the end of this rather remarkable film, I feel like we know both her, Bucharest, and, by the way, the state of the globalized world much more intimately than we did going in. It is a very hard film to describe, so let's get to it. But first, a clip. In the scene, we're going to hear Angela Manolake's character chatting with the director, a real-life director, Uwe Boll, who's playing himself. It's on the set of one of his movies filming in Bucharest. Let's listen.
I saw a clip with you on YouTube when you were beating the shit out of some film critics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Why did you do that?
No, I hated them. They were trashing my films. They were not even looking my films. And then I got only bad reviews for all of my films. So I said, look, guys, if you want to destroy me, I destroy you in the ring.
Yeah. That is history of cinema.
Yeah, but I hope my films are also, in a way, history of cinema, not only my boxing fights against the critics.
I saw your film, Assault on Wall Street, and, you know, sometimes I have the envy to take the gun and do the same thing with my boss, for example. Don't tell him.
Dana, let me start with you. This is a hard film to describe succinctly, or at least I find it that way. It's nearly 3 hours long. It's made up of disparate and funny elements. Where to even start? Are you familiar with this director's work? Let's begin there.
Well, I've only seen one other film by this director, which was I believe his last film before this, from 2022, which has a very goofy title. It's called Bad Luck Banging or Loony Porn. and it has some similar elements in that it is also, woven from different kinds of texts. that extend beyond something that Radu Jude himself filmed. And it also has a kind of similarly bawdy, raucous sense of humor. The premise of that movie is that a teacher's sex tape that she makes with her husband gets onto the internet, and, you know, all the remaining repercussions, including a school board meeting in which she's dressed down and they try to fire her. Anyway, that movie is fascinating. I recommend it. It's fun to see. I don't think it's the masterpiece that this film is. I really want to see everything Radu Jude has done now. In general, I'm pretty crazy about Romanian new wave movies, which is just a very general title for basically any movie coming out of Romania in the past, 10 years or so, 15 maybe. But this movie really, really nails it. I was so proud that I was the one who suggested this for this week's show, because I just had a feeling from the way lots of people, including Slate's own Sam Adams, wrote about this movie that we would have lots to say about it and that it would be intellectually vibrant. The thing that Sam says about it in his write-up on Slate, which I think is really, really true, is that there's few movies that capture the feeling of 21st century life, of, you know, life right now, 2024 life, the way this movie does. And that, I think, has to do with the way the internet interpenetrates everyone's experience at every moment, right? With the gig economy that has this poor, overstressed PA driving around for, you know, what she's saying is going to be a 20-hour day of trying to collect all these interviews, you know, with just the confidence with which Radu Jude brings all these elements together and then intercuts them in a way that's hard to describe with this 1981 Romanian movie, like you say, which is called, I think, Angela Goes On is the English title for the movie, which is all about a woman driving around Bucharest, right? The same thing this movie is about, but obviously a very, very different Bucharest under Ceausescu's dictatorship in the early 1980s. And then there's this beautiful moment. I almost don't want to reveal too much about it because it's such a surprise, but he brings the fictive universe of that 1981 movie into the 2024 universe of Angela, you know, our heroine, in this way that's just so funny and unexpected, and that ends up having all of these repercussions about, you know, the story that she is documenting, right? So this story she's documenting all day long, or a lot of different people's stories, are stories of workers who've had accidents at work. And she's making a safety video for a company that essentially wants to wash its hands of responsibility for any of these accidents by having all of these workers who, every single one of them in some way or another, you know, was being mistreated, ignored, you know, abused by the company they worked for. Yet the message of these interviews they have to record is wear your safety equipment. In other words, blame the victim, right? And the whole movie is building that joke in a way. But then that joke has this beautiful payoff in the last half hour, which I also won't reveal, but in which the movie takes a completely different formal tactic than anything that came before. And I just love seeing a movie that's so formally inventive. It reminded me of like what watching Godard must have felt like in the 60s, right? Like seeing somebody take film form apart and put it together in a different way.
This movie's just gripping. There are formal experiments that disrespect audience attention, and there are formal experiments that are very cunning and canny about audience and attention, you know? Like sometimes the experiment is like, what if I did something boring or stupid or nonsensical and then saw if the audience would put up with me? Like sometimes that's what avant-garde feels like. And this is one where the acuity about what makes a scene compelling. I mean, she's just driving around all the time, but it's almost like a thriller because she's so exhausted, you think she might crash at any moment. And in all of these ways, the tension is ratcheted up, sort of the sense of threat on the road, the fact that just driving is actually an incredibly dangerous, terrifying. It's a thing we do all the time that should be terrifying. That sounds like it's maybe more terrifying in Bucharest than in many other places. And the movie also takes a striking formal diversion to make that point, which I also won't reveal, but it's never boring. It's really fascinating. And some of the fascination is like, what is happening here? I also think the way in which it, you know, our main character, the modern day Angela, has this kind of incel TikTok alter ego that she finds irresistible even in her exhaustion. She always has the energy to perform this TikTok character of Bobita. That's the name she has for the kind of vile incel guy that she plays on TikTok. And I was interested to learn in reading our preparatory materials that the actress who plays Angela had invented Bobita prior to the film. Like that character is not an invention of the, you know, of a screenplay, and then they went out and found an actress who could do that. That was sort of part of that actress's world, which was the pastiche of it and the intelligence of how the film uses that character was a marvel to me. It didn't even occur to me that that might be the case when I was watching the movie.
I'm just so relieved you both love this movie as much as I did. I thought it was, I mean, really, I mean, this is an overused word in my own vocabulary. I apologize for that, but this is a masterpiece. This is exactly like that. It's like watching a Godard or Antonioni movie and just watching someone completely re-establish what the parameters of cinematic possibility are. I mean, it's totally gripping. It's very pointed politically and very conscious of its own political aims without being didactic. It immerses you in the longueurs of a day that goes on way too long and involves too much driving without ever being boring. I agree, it's gripping throughout. This actress is captivating. We learn a lot about her incidentally. We learn that she has a literary sensibility. She's got Proust on her nightstand. She stops to buy literary books from a seller working the side of the road, a bookseller working the side of the road. She's a remarkable thinker and talker, but the possibilities of her life are severely curtailed by her need to work a gig job and work herself to the bone doing it. And it reminded me of one of my other favorite movies from the past 20 years, Tony Erdmann. But in addition to that, it's kind of an extended essay on how this country traded communism for finance capitalism. And it got the butt end of the deal in both instances. And so the contrast with this 1981 movie points up what's happened to their world over the course of it without making an overly simplistic point about how the two are equivalent or how there's been a horrible loss. There's no nostalgia for whatsoever, for as far as I can tell, for communist Romania. But it shows how, for all their ideological, maybe massive ideological discrepancies, they both instrumentalize and thereby dehumanize human beings. They turn people into cogs. And it's extraordinary to think that a movie that's this formally daring also marshals all of that to drive home to you in such a pointedly non-didactic way. A message like that is just a tour de force of cinema, sort of daring and feeling. It's just a great movie.
I mean, the thing that was interesting to me is how political it is without being annoying. I think that's very hard to do. It's so much about, and so explicitly about, how, you know, the people at the bottom of any system, any political or economic system, are getting screwed no matter what. And yet it is not didactic or preachy or annoying. It's so sly and wry and, again, humanistic in its look at the world. And part of what makes our modern day Angela such an interesting hero is that she has not resorted to the thing that people often have to do of kind of putting blinkers on to human suffering in order to get by or get through their days. Like, she's someone who's a very raw nerve, who will buy the books from the woman at the roadside, in part because she wants a book and has great literary taste, but in part because she engages with the woman whose hustle it is to sell books at the traffic light. It's just so unusual to find a work of art that's making such a radically political point that is not just like insufferably blunt and stupid. It's so incredible. I don't know, Dana, if you can reveal how it comes to achieve that, but it's a marvel.
Yeah, Julia, I completely agree. It's at once, it's expansive, right? It's about sort of global capital and not just Romania, but the entire 21st century kind of global economy. And yet it's also a really intimate portrait of this particular woman who we, first see waking up naked at 5:50 a.m. And we basically follow her through the day. It all takes place during this one long extended workday, which isn't even over. When the movie ends, there's still work ahead for poor Angela. But it makes complete sense when you read about the fact that, for example, the social media character that she becomes, who really in a way is her art, right? I mean, to the extent that she has any freedom of expression within her world of being imprisoned by this awful job. It's because she goes on TikTok and turns into this horrible character and essentially expresses, she's almost doing some sort of pop art parody of exactly what it is about the world surrounding her that's so ugly and so oppressive, right? So in those moments, even though what she's saying is very ugly and the horrible face filter makes her look like an awful, scary man, she's expressing a form of freedom that nowhere else in the movie does she get to experience. And something about the way Ilinka Monolake, the actress, understands that, and brings the viewer into her world really makes you feel at the end of the movie like you've spent time with this very unusual and special person and seen the world through their eyes. And while I'm raving about the acting in this movie, I have to also mention that Nina Haas is in it, the great German actress who, I think probably most people will know from Tar, where she played Cate Blanchett's wife. But, she's also been in tons and tons of German movies and is extraordinary. She has a small but absolutely crucial role as this kind of soulless corporate executive who is a client of the company that Angela's company works for, thus the person who is asking for these workplace safety videos to be made. So there's a couple moments where she appears in Zoom calls or she gets chauffeured around by Angela, and she's just incredibly icy and frightening, but also so touching in that she seems like the world's loneliest successful pantsuit business executive. And the movie is so full of little touches like that. So like you say, Julia, although it's about a world of immense cruelty, it's a movie, I think, of great kindness and humanism.
Yeah, I love that it accords humanity to the Nina Haas character. And also, despite being so bleak, I did not leave the movie feeling bleak and hopeless. Like, one of the other gifts of it is that because it suggests to you that her embrace of this bizarre TikTok play and performance is a kind of creative freedom, it almost makes you look at the world and all of the stupid social media that everybody's on is kind of like, if you reimagine that as little acts of human defiance all around you, it makes them seem less depressing. Not that all of them come from the same place or have the same artistry, but if you think of the world as like a world of millions of small filmmakers unlocked, kind of playing with form, it's a different way to look at our modern hellscape that left me feeling energized rather than enervated.
Weirdly uplifting, Julia, I agree, for how often that character is expressing or finding a way to express her freedom in the cracks of this neoliberal dystopia. It's really an amazing film, top to bottom. I'm glad we all agree. That is a six-fisted table pound, if you've ever heard one on this show. Please seek out this movie. It's going to be opening wider. You should be able to find it. Do not expect too much from the end of the world. Please go see it and tell everyone you know to go see it after you have, if you agree with us. All right, let's move on.
Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on all your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply. Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on all your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
Well, Steve Martin was a struggling comedian in the early to mid-'70s. He was catching breaks here and there, but kind of on the fringes of show business and finally taking those breaks nowhere. He was so incredibly hard to categorize. It was comedy without punchlines or even overly obvious places for the audience to laugh. It was impossible to know whether this guy was dumb, playing dumb, or a deconstructive wizard taking comedy someplace totally new. And then it's amazing. I was there for it. Something suddenly clicked and Martin's act got hot. Within a couple of years, he went from playing 2-bit clubs to arenas. He was quite genuinely the first rock star comedian. His tour was bigger one year than Fleetwood Mac's. This in the direct aftermath of Rumors, right? One of the biggest rock albums of all time. Of course, we all know what happened next. Steve Martin went into movies and he became a staple of the American comedy landscape, which he's remained ever since. It's an incredible run. And to do it justice, Apple TV has a new documentary. It's called Steve! And then in parentheses, Martin, a documentary in 2 pieces. And it comes from Morgan Neville, who you may remember from the Mr. Rogers documentary. All right, in the clip we're about to hear, Martin is at home bouncing around ideas with Martin Short. They're about to go on tour. And this is very recently, a couple of old hands joshing around.
What's happening right now is for the last year and a half, we've just been collecting jokes for shows coming up next month, so we want to be prepared. Basically, look at the new jokes and see if they belong or where they can go. Or, I mean, if they're funny, I take them. If they're not funny, I give them to Marty. Yeah. I love a comedian's opening line because it sets the tone for the entire stupid show.
I think that's funny.
You know, we haven't performed in a year and a half, which will become obvious as the show goes on.
I'm not nervous, I'm just unprepared. It's the same idea.
How many of you applauded because you thought I was dead? Ever have one of those moments when you walk into a room and forget why you're there?
Well, it's funny.
Okay. I know what you're thinking. These hearing aids make my ass look amazing.
Right away, it's a premise of you're old. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can follow it up with a line about your prostate.
Julia, let me start with you. I mean, obviously, Martin is this giant. I think it's been well known about him for a while that he can be an inscrutable human being, that he's an art collector. Much of the documentary is familiar, but it's way more complete and intimate. It's quite long. It's 2 parts, each in excess of an hour. What did you make of this recap?
So I should start by saying that I consider myself a Steve Martin fan. Grew up in the era of sort of Roxanne and LA Story and his kind of comedic leading man moment in culture, and knew that he had this sort of rangy SNL wild man comedy past, goofy man comedy past. I somehow feel like I've watched this documentary and know less about Steve Martin than I did before I went in. I found it to be a weirdly unrevealing object, even as it shares, it's 2 90-minute companion films, and it shares plenty of archival footage and photography and tells a large chunk of stories about his life and, kind of pits then against now, then sort of a desperate striving for success, artistic and professional success, and now kind of the relaxed, happy older age where he's found peace and marriage and fatherhood. And I don't know, all of that sounds like a lot. And yet somehow I come away feeling distant. Did you guys have that experience?
Yeah, Julia, I've read Steve Martin's memoir, Born Standing Up, back when it came out. I don't know, it was probably 10 years ago, maybe. One of the best memoirs I've ever read by an entertainer. Really, really recommend Born Standing Up. And it discloses a lot more about his coming to fame than this movie does, even though this movie is replete with great clips. I have to say that is Morgan Neville's strong point, I think, as a documentary filmmaker, is he is a great archivist, or he has a great archival team, and he's great at finding things that illustrate some of the ideas he's trying to show and weaving them together. As far as the biographical, he's such a private person that certainly a lot about his current life we don't get to see. I think we would all love a tour of his art collection, right? But that's not something that we really get to see, although he does discuss a couple of his favorite paintings in some great moments. But I do think it's impossible to come out of this without a very warm feeling towards Steve Martin, maybe warmer than one would have had before thinking at all about how long he struggled before he became the huge phenomenon that he was in the mid-70s. And he talks about that quite a bit, both in archival interview clips with David Letterman and other places, and with the filmmaker Morgan Neville himself, that he had been doing his act, his very weird stand-up act, with the prop comedy and the balloons and the kind of the basically aggressively stupid, I think, as somebody describes it that way, right? This sort of like abstract and intellectually stupid character that he played. He had been doing that for 10 or 15 years before he even started to be a hit as a live comic, much less appear on Saturday Night Live, becoming the leading man that you remember in the kind of 80s and 90s, Julia. And I think the movie is at its strongest in that first half where it's tracking that material, maybe just because he can't hide quite as well. The contemporary Steve Martin has control over what he will show the camera and what he will tell interviewers. And so the second half, I think, is, while it's a very sweet sort of look at his current life in New York with his wife and child, it's less illustrative about who he is as a comedian and an artist than the first half.
Yeah, I found the second half very distanced and way too padded out. The first half is interesting enough that the padding doesn't really get in the way. The second half definitely suffers from it being a kind of authorized project, right? That Martin, it's sort of like the magazine profile minus the editorial independence of the profiler. This was just made in cooperation with Steve Martin. He's showing only what he wants you to see. There's a somewhat touching but also absurd moment where his very young daughter walks into the room and he quite rightly decides that he doesn't want her image to appear in the documentary or maybe in any public document whatsoever. A noble choice. Nonetheless, what they do is they use, some kind of in post-production digital technique to turn her into a stick figure. So you get all of the endearing power of him interacting with her. And he does. He's clearly a loving, hands-on, very warm father. But it only points up one of the weaknesses of the second half of it, which is what a sort of Vaseline on the lens portrait it really is of who this person is now. That said, I thought the first part was quite gripping for a lot of reasons, and it sort of needed its 90 minutes because you have this very, very peculiar young man. I believe he's born in 1945, so he's a paradigmatic baby boomer, coming of age alongside all of those touchstones in a household dominated by a deeply withholding and undermining father, which shapes his entire life, which is a theme of the documentary and quite powerful. And it's such a classic boomer story, right? You're in a wealthy enough household that you have your own bedroom and some spending money. And if there's something emotionally threatening about the common spaces of the house, you can withdraw into the bedroom and your own sort of constructed world and persona, which is clearly what happened with Martin, because two obsessions take over his life relatively early. The banjo is a little bit later. The first one is magic, right? So he brings an extraordinary amount of patience and discipline for a boy to mastering magic. And the second thing, when he's starting around when he's 17, is the banjo. And, he utterly devotes himself to these technically challenging, highly intricate sleights of hand and kind of masters both. And there's this extraordinary echo later in the documentary where, for Pennies from Heaven, his second movie after The Jerk, he has to learn tap dancing. And I don't know about you guys, were you floored by that clip, the archival clip of a rehearsal where he's learning how to tap dance? And he seems to have become a virtuosic tap dancer. I mean, he's really astonishingly good at it. All kinds of other things go into this strange person, right? A creature of total discipline who puts on the facade of a total boob, a completely unself-conscious boob. He was also a philosophy major at UCLA. So in that sense, you get this extraordinary portrait of a self-made performer of kind of world-class abilities and originality. And to me, that's quite powerful. Julia, I came to him slightly before you did. I was in 7th grade when he started making the Saturday Night Live appearances, which just utterly rocked me and my friend's world, right? I mean, it was just kind of, he totally seemed to be redefining comedy and the wild and crazy guy skits. It seems to me it's that moment where counterculture is, of the boomers is becoming the dominant culture in some sense. Because like Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton, who we spoke about earlier, he's the closest thing or one of the few totally consensus likable figures we have in this country right now. Doesn't everyone kind of love Steve Martin?
I mean, I think so. And this movie, I guess the flip side of my initial comment of the movie leaving me feeling like I know him less than I did before is maybe not a criticism, but a testament to it, right? Because I probably started out knowing the most bland and basic and accessible Steve Martin, the one who pretended to be a romantic leading man, even though we learn that in his life he found it very difficult to kind of find romantic partnership and open up in that way until very late in life. So maybe in learning that he is so distant and mysterious, that is the job of the documentary, and that's the documentary doing its work. But I do agree that the first half, among the things that struck me about it and that I liked about it, was that it spent just so long on his sort of sweaty, unsuccessful era, and was really interested in and unafraid of, for all that it's a documentary that I'm sure he had a hand in, as celebrities do these days with their documentaries. It's kind of unafraid of showing the work. And that's what struck me about the tap dancing sequence too. He does successfully figure out how to tap dance, but you see him struggling to master it. You see him working really hard to master it. I feel like usually the How I Made It documentary kind of gives you a couple quick cuts of the flop sweat, and then it's like, and then there was that night when it all clicked. And the night when it all clicked maybe often happens like 20% of the way through. The night when it all clicked is like the final, your 95%. So you spend a lot of time just showing the work and the struggle and the kind of quest that he was on, which does feel lonely and sort of inexplicable to himself. Certainly, if you like Steve Martin, I think it's worth spending some time with. But I agree that the second half feels a lot, and it should feel more intimate because he's inviting you into his spaces and his places and introducing you to his wife. It feels much more guarded because he's currently deciding what to share.
Yeah, there are two chapters that almost don't resemble, they could be two completely different documentaries. I was going to say, Steve, when you said how amazed were you that he could tap dance for Pennies from Heaven, I was not amazed because that was a movie my family and I watched over and over when I was growing up, along with The Jerk, which was one of my dad's favorite movies, I remember. I think Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is probably the other Steve Martin that we watched the most. That was sort of like the VHS was worn out from so many watches. And he tells, talk about self-disclosure. The moment when he talks about John Candy and how much he loved working with him and how much they loved each other, and tears up as he's looking at the old script for Planes, Trains, is a really revealing moment.
Yeah, that's a wonderful moment. All right, so it's Steve Martin, a documentary in 2 pieces. It's on Apple TV. Check it out.
Now, from the music of the past comes the musical of the future, Pennies from Heaven, starring Steve Martin in a dazzlingly different role.
No more money in the bank. No cute baby we can spank.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So, just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
All right, now is the moment in our podcast when we endorse Dana. What do you have?
My endorsement actually comes out of one of our topics this week, out of the movie Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World. The moment I finished watching the movie, as I said in our segment, I was immediately texting friends about how they should see it and seek it out. And at that same moment, I happened to get this email in my inbox from the film critic Nicholas Rapold, who had just released a conversation with Radu Jude, the filmmaker. So on his podcast, which I had never listened to before, which is called The Last Thing I Saw, he has a half-an-hour conversation with Radu Jude about the movie. And he asks just the questions I would have wanted to ask if I had sat down with Radu Jude, who, as you can imagine, after seeing Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World, is a really thoughtful, incredibly well-read, just a funny, fascinating person. So if you want to hear a good conversation about the movie after you've seen it, I suggest you do it after so that you don't have anything spoiled. Not that it's really a plot-based movie. But the podcast is, again, called The Last Thing I Saw with Nicholas Rapold, and he's interviewing Radu Jude.
I'm literally downloading that now as we speak. Oh my God, I cannot wait. Julia, what do you have?
Okay, my endorsement this week, like a couple of our topics, Cowboy Carter and our Romanian movie whose title I cannot remember, are the kinds of brilliant work of art that when you finish them, you immediately want to be in mental conversation with other people dissecting the work. And I had that experience reading Zadie Smith's most recent novel, The Fraud, which came out last year and is kind of a historical novel set in Victorian England. It reimagines a social circle around Dickens and another writer. I loved this book, and critics did not really, or some of them did and some of them didn't. And I have yet to find the piece that fully sings the song of my response to this book, which I was thrilled by. So if any of you out there have read it and loved it and have thoughts on why it was amazing, please do send them along to culturefest@slate.com. But it felt like an imagining of the Victorian past as the present. It felt very animated and close and near and fresh, and very much from a particular woman's perspective on this world of male achievement, and kind of reckoning with British history, with slavery. I don't know. It's a great book. Please read The Fraud and then talk to me about it, because I still have not had the conversation I want to have, despite reading 20 different articles about the book after I finished it. I still haven't quite found the conversation I'm looking for.
All right. Well, continuing my recent kick in which I'm reading some of the canonical writers of Australia, listeners might remember I endorsed Helen Garner, her nonfiction book, This House of Grief, which is just amazing. That book really delivers. Penelope Fitzgerald was an Australian novelist. She wrote poetry, essays, also biography. She won the Booker in '79 for the novel Offshore. She also was nominated for the Booker another time for The Bookshop. But the novel I'm reading is The Blue Flower, which is a historical novel, takes place in kind of the sort of early flowering of German Romanticism. And it sounds esoteric, but it's actually quite funny, clever, beautifully drawn novel. And its central figure is the poet Novalis. But it just captures a moment of ferment where something is happening and no one can name it. And yet that aliveness, that tingle of aliveness that runs through a group of more or less like-minded people situated in the same time and place and energizing one another in these inchoate and very hard to name ways. And it's very human. I mean, in the sense that you feel as though this is a set of actual and living people. It's not a stuffy costume drama. In other words, it's really a wonderful novel. It's beautifully written. It's The Blue Flower by Penelope Fitzgerald. Julia, thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.
Dana, thanks a lot. That was fun.
Thanks, Steve.
You will find links to some of the things we talked about today at our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest, and you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory music is by the composer Nicholas Pertel. Our production assistant is Kat Hong. Our producer is Jared Downing. For Dana Stevens and Julia Turner, I'm Stephen Metcalf. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you soon.
The new Stars series, Mary and George, starring Julianne Moore and Nicholas Galitzine, tells a story almost too outrageous to be true, but shockingly, it is. With next to nothing to her name and looking to elevate her social standing, Mary Villiers sets her handsome and charming son George on the path to seduce King James I and become his all-powerful lover. This show is full of wit, scandal, action. You won't be able to look away. Mary and George premieres April 5th, only on Stars and the Stars app.
When we made our McDonald's Spicy Chicken McNuggets, you were praise hands emoji. Then we ran out, and you were streaming tears emoji. Now they're back, so you can be grinning face with sweat emoji. Order ahead on the McDonald's app.
And get Money Mouth Face emoji with 2 orders of crispy, irresistible 10-piece McNuggets, spicy or classic, for just $6. Limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.